Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, guys. I appreciate everyone spending time with us. New Zealand is the apple of the world's eye. I started coming in 2010. I grew up in Montana, and I love fly fishing. So the very first time I came was for personal, actually chasing big trout. But I appreciate the fact that Spark has partnered with us, and I think you're going to get some insight as to why, and a lot of the trends and changes that have going on in the threat landscape. And it's actually moving at a blistering pace. So I'll try to cover that a little bit. If you have questions, jump in. It would be cool if we had an interactive session. But like Phil said, I started my career at AT&T in managed services, and I was lucky to get tons of experience with very large customers like American Express and Siemens and United Health Group, Honeywell, Citicorp. A lot of big customers. A huge education for me. And so as MPLS started to actually take over the complexity that we were using and designing within customers around complex routing protocols, I saw the need to move into layer 4 through 7 and found my way to Radware. But we're a market leader in application delivery controller along with F5. And we were the first to actually introduce security as a tenant in the data center around high availability. Okay? So we acquired the machine learning algorithms that are still in use today. They've evolved 3 or 4 generations, and I'll try to maybe cover that at the end if you have questions. But essentially, the US financial service market went under hellfire in like 2012. And for the last, 12 years, my team has been transforming ISPs, network services, to try to address that problem. Okay? I wanted to give you like 15 trillion reasons to care and prioritize this within your own company. The reality is that there's a vicious cycle taking place at the moment in the threat landscape from the point of view that, PI data is being lost at an alarming rate. It's accelerating fraud and the monetization of hacktivism and the use of customer information to actually steal money. And you see it in the form of account takeovers, denial of service, but the breaches that are happening almost daily. And I think it's important that we don't get desensitized to this because we do want to stop it. My mic is cutting out a little bit, just so you guys know. But, I spent the year basically traveling the world. And the one thing that I see that's common everywhere in the world is that the level of sophistication of the attacks, especially around randomization, has exhausted analysts everywhere. Okay? It's basically an unsustainable problem without the right technology to address it. Okay? What I also see is that customers have acquired disparate technologies for different problems, and hackers are navigating the blind spots between those service components. Okay? And I think what's most alarming to me personally is the automation in use and the fact that the vulnerability assessment is so fast at the moment that they're leveraging CVEs to infiltrate infrastructure, and it's so advanced in terms of automation that the attacks cost is really going down, and they're moving into the small and medium enterprise. So as you look in your Asian market, small to medium enterprise accounts for about 97% of all businesses. 85% of employment is done by small to medium enterprise, and consumers are basically leveraging e-commerce at a 90 percentile rate, and they don't intend to stop doing so. So it becomes a pretty important topic as, basically the consequence of the shift in threat landscape, which I'll give some illustrations and exact examples of what I'm talking about when I say that, and the complexity of moving into virtualization, public cloud, Kubernetes environments, and how do you address all of these things at the same time? There's clearly a lack of security competency, core competency, to address the layer 7 defense challenge. And you're going to see some examples of AI in use in this ecosystem that should scare you. I was heavily involved in the defense of the Ukraine government for the last 2 years. The last spring, so nearly 2 years ago, we also saw the KillNet campaign lead out into the private sector and I spent, I manage OEMs with Cisco and Checkpoint and other major manufacturers, and we probably covered around 350 healthcare customers in the first 3 months of 2023, okay? So, just to give you some comparison between one of these private sector events versus what the Ukraine saw, a typical KillNet healthcare customer may have saw bot attacks in the neighborhood of around 20 million, okay? If you compare the same time interval of the defense of the Ukraine government, they were dealing with event volume of around 415 million, okay? So we saw these techniques being used that started out in volumetric denial of service. They moved into application penetration. They tried to go towards bot attacks, and eventually they started moving into client-side injections, okay? And we'll talk about that. But we saw them basically try to bypass every control that we have available, okay? And it was a great validation of our intellectual property. Imagine that in the cloud platform that's used for defense, we also have the ability to run algorithms in parallel to our production countermeasures, okay? And that gives us the ability to validate new techniques with less intrusion to legitimate users and come with a high degree of confidence when we start to apply those to real production traffic, okay? But the one thing that I noted through this process is that these state-sponsored cyber events, they nearly had unlimited resources, okay? And I think that's something, as you look at the motivation and the shift from political and religious to financial, is a bit concerning, okay? This is an example of a private sector event that happened several months ago in the Middle East against a bank. And, I highlight here the number of countries that were exposed to these events over the past, 2 years. I think we've seen the campaigns go around the world at least 6 times. But this is the first indication of a campaign. This is a good representation of a campaign that had volumetric component. It lasted for numerous days. It moved into RPS level encrypted flood attacks, which is really what I'm trying to explain to some extent. And imagine that when you talk about 16 million requests per second of encrypted payload, imagine that in all of New Zealand, I think there's about 5.6 million people. So imagine that everyone in New Zealand going to the exact same website and making a page request 3 times in a single second, okay? Now, I think the more important detail is that the legitimate traffic pattern on this particular domain was 80 requests per second, okay? So the intellectual property, the challenge for the actual machine learning applications is not necessarily to block the flood. I mean, I can black hole an attack, didn't block it. The goal that we have in mind, and the thing that we take pride in, what makes us the best in the world, is the fact that we're able to distinguish those 80 legitimate sessions out of the 16 million and make sure that they go uninterrogated, okay? We don't throw CAPTCHAs at them. We don't rate limit them. We're not independently, impacting them in a way that is undeterministic to the MSSP, to Spark, okay? It's not the small business that is falling victim to this alone. It's also the hyperscalers. Microsoft has actually gone down twice in the 2 years of this type of attack. All right, they have their own DDoS infrastructure protection. They sell it as a service. They have their own application security components. So why are they going down? It's because the only way to actually defend these type of attacks is with modern control. Okay, it's that simple. Now, when you look at the hacker himself, or the script kiddie, a lot of these attacks inside like IPTV ecosystems and things like that are actually gamers. Okay, imagine inside AT&T Uverse, we defend, auto-mitigate about 250,000 attacks a quarter. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you can see the attacks start. 5 o'clock, they pick up even more. And so imagine we're just defending these seamlessly without any human intervention, okay? But if you look at the tools that they're using, they are a combination of all of these attack techniques that include denial of service, application security, bot. What starts to become a little more alarming is that on GitHub you can find bypass attacks for Akamai and Imperva and Cloudflare. And we monitor these closely. Matter of fact, I work with teams that are constantly penetrating our own platforms and exposing like encoded events that we missed. And our R&D is actively pursuing resolution for. Okay? So it's a constant battle to stay in front of these events. But fundamentally, they have also started to move to the client browser. Okay? So as you start to think about PCI DSS compliance, modern compliance, it's not enough to defend your own web domain if you're not actually monitoring, from a service worker point of view, data leakage on the browser that's being consuming your domain's information. And you ask yourself, like, how do these events actually happen? Well, most people are probably most familiar with supply chain attacks, right? And fundamentally, it's every web domain transacts with an end user via HTML. And in that HTML is third-party JavaScripts. And so you're now having to account for the fact that some third party may have been infiltrated and is passing down malware to the end user that allows them to export credit card information, PII data, okay? Now, I'm not an evangelist. I'm an architect. I started my career doing I was a routing expert at CCIE. I spent all of my time going to major accounts and dealing with major problems, okay? So I'm passing this on not to scare you, but to basically inform you, okay? That we're only seeing just a scratch of the surface of what the automation and the tools that these people are using are capable of. I think this morning I looked it up, and today there's 268,000 active CVEs in the wild. I think 19,000 are under active research. All the 30,000 plus breaches that we've seen this year have been with 100 CVEs, less than 100. So think about that. There's 286,000 out there in the wild. There's 20,000 that are being researched. There's only 100 that actually were used to breach. Now, the hackers have the LLM agents that are accelerating that CV discovery process within networks at an alarming rate. I think BT recently reported that they've seen a 10,000% increase in vulnerability assessments, okay? So imagine that, the automation is out there and actively scanning constantly. Now what I am trying to explain here is that using GTP4 and LLM agents that have been seeded with the CVE definition, that the hackers are able to reach a penetration percentage of 87% with less than 5 retries. That's nuts. I mean, if you think about that, I mean, ZAP and Metasploit, for people that don't know, are common penetration tools that are used for penetration testing by most companies out there. When used alone, they couldn't penetrate any of them. It was a 0 percentile. So just by adding this LLM agent to assist those tools, they got to an 87% success rate. Okay? Now, if you think about the discussion I just had around CVE exposure, imagine that, I don't know, how many of you have been involved in CVE management, like risk patching, or however you would describe it, like whack-a-mole kind of. I deal with it on a number of levels, you know, from an OS conformity and delivery point of view in public clouds, and it's a constant routine, essentially, to be scanning and ultimately be delivering resolutions to these problems. But if you think about how long it takes an ISV, a vendor, to deliver a patch, it can be months. I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt and saying that in this case, they can do it in 24 hours, okay? Which everyone in here say, bullshit. But let's give them the benefit of the doubt that they can do it in 24 hours. Now imagine that when those CVEs are announced, if you put it into the LLM agent-assisted automation model, that within an hour, it's exploited. Someone has penetrated. They've conducted an SQL injection that has allowed them to actually start pulling at a very low rate your entire database, your entire PII infrastructure of your end customer, okay? And the challenge here is that we see these GTP4 API, API keys, being sold at about a rate of about 400 a day today. You can buy them on the dark net for about $15. And the cost of an attack associated with leveraging those expenses is around $8.80, okay? So for a very low cost, hackers can conduct these events, benefit from them monetarily, and fuel the fraudulent activity they have once obtaining all of this information about end users, okay? So it's a vicious cycle. It's a vicious cycle that's playing out and people are falling victim to. Now, I started with this point about the small to medium enterprise and the risk associated with the fact that the cost of the attack is going down, the vulnerability assessment is, you know, moving at a blistering pace, and it's moving the small to medium enterprise into the targets of these hackers, okay? And I'm going to show you some statistics from an Asian audit. You know, a good friend of mine, Kerry Singleton from Cisco, had actually conducted this study. And you can see for yourself that they're the size of the businesses that they talk to, and about 3,700 of them in 14 countries, okay? And I'll try my best to highlight the input from New Zealand to try to localize that to you. But 74% of New Zealanders companies admit that they've had some type of incident in the last 12 months, okay? If you look at the type of incidents that actually took place, they're exactly what we just spoke about. If I move from right to left, it's those zero-day exposures, the man-in-the-middle attacks, which is basically form jacking, SQL injection, denial of service. DNS tunneling is essentially a style of denial of service that moves them into very sophisticated phishing campaigns, right? And everyone probably has seen it either via text or some email where the contextualization, the social engineering associated with the phishing campaigns has increased dramatically. Like, it's challenging for most people, especially, if it's challenging for us, you can imagine how it's for our parents or other people that are actually falling victim to these actual messages, okay? And eventually, once someone has gained some hook into a system, managing malware and conducting, action escalations and east to west penetration is much easier. I think one of the challenges associated for us as a cybersecurity community is that the bots have also become very complicated and very expensive to remove, okay? So you've got this low cost of the attack, but the very high expense of trying to remove them. And you say, well, why can't I just reboot that endpoint and get rid of that malware? Well, most command and control systems today are moving into social engineering. Like you see them in prompts within Spotify. And, imagine, being one of these high profile, communication providers, and people are giving basically a trail to that software that through traditional searching, you're not going to block an endpoint from searching the internet. So traditional searching, they're actually finding keys along the way to survive these reboots of endpoints and reestablish bot behavior, okay? Now, what is the financial impact of these incidences on customers? Well, according to the survey, 62% said it cost them more than $500,000. And 16%, 18%, are over $1 million. And I think one of the reasons that I'm passionate about telling this story is because, if you think about the impact on that in the small to medium enterprise, large enterprise, Change Healthcare is a great example. HIPAA just filed an update on their breach. Their losses are in the $2.8 billion today. So imagine you go into the small to medium enterprise with this attack, and it's putting people out of business, okay? And I think that's the message that I would carry, is that 73% of New Zealanders believe that if they were actually, enterprises believe that if they were actually targeted by one of these attacks, that it would put them out of business, okay? So what do we give in terms of recommendations? Well, obviously you need to have a security platform that provides you full stack protection, regardless of what the deployment ecosystem is. You need to have the defense capabilities in order to defend against it, to protect it. You need to be able to defend the client-side browser today. It's in March, I think March of 2025, it's going to be a mandatory PCI DSS compliance definition. It started this year in March as a recommendation, and next year it's going to be mandatory, okay? You also need these behavioral techniques in order to define remediation for zero-day attacks, okay? Something that can not only detect complex events, but also produce a footprint that surgically removes the attack and does not impact legitimate users, and adapts to the changes that are taking place in real time. Imagine that I see it continuously with legacy tools, that analysts are just getting worn out by the changes in the attack pattern routinely throughout the day. So when a customer goes under an attack, it's oftentimes sustained because of this randomization, okay? And imagine that without the machine learning, the techniques in order to distinguish good and bad bots, for example, who have already either authenticated or bypassed some type of zero trust framework. So they're, by all means of the security gateway architecture, compliant. You start to actually zero in on intent and misuse, okay? Which is not easy today. The class 5 bots are pretty much indistinguishable from a legitimate user, okay? So you start to think about the fact that what is their activity? What are they doing in terms of page clicks, and is that normal or abnormal? And you know, I also mentioned that it's very important to avoid impacting legitimate users. You know, so we want to avoid throwing CAPTCHAs at legitimate clients and eroding user experience, which for the last decade everyone has spent an enormous amount of energy, you know, engineering that. It's actually been proven to be the key basis for e-commerce and maintaining customer alignment to a particular domain, okay? Everything we do from a delivery point of view is engineered to provide expression level security at volumetric scale, okay? And so when we talk about, and I'm going to show you on the next slide, this Spark or unified platform that provides all of these defense techniques that can be tailored to the needs of the individual user, enterprise. But imagine that they're working together to provide the absolute best security, but escalating through risk score analysis to volumetric hardware-based mitigation so that we can scale. You know, imagine that we have to decrypt payloads in order to engineer an algorithm that's form-based, you know. Today, like in these encrypted web floods that I spoke about, I focused on the RPS because it's an easy thing for people to appreciate just in terms of, you know, community and volume and targeting a particular domain and what was the architecture and capacity of that particular domain. It's easy to overwhelm something. But, you know, imagine that in our own security gateway architecture, our solution, that we have to be able to address that high encryption rate ourselves as well. So imagine as an event starts to play out, we need to expand the use of cryptography in order to avoid impact on legitimate users all the same, okay? But we're heavily using machine learning and AI in the systems. We do it in the context of security event management, so these adaptive protections. Imagine that if I were, and I'm going to be around for the next 2 days, and if anyone would like to have, you know, a more targeted demonstration, I could actually show it to you. But imagine that the machine learning algorithms that I'm talking about that are generating, you know, 3 generations of algorithms. You know, originally it was enough to produce a negative blocking footprint, okay? What we're really good at, and what we still deal with on a regular basis, is like take, for example, a high volume UDP flood. Imagine that the attacker is constantly randomizing that UDP, the packet attributes associated with the payload, okay? And the algorithm is smart enough to actually pick up those attribute values that are common amongst all of the different sessions, and with a single footprint, surgically block it without impacting legitimate users. NTT Docomo just did a study between us and Arbor, and it showed these algorithms at a 99.1 percentile effectiveness without any human intervention, okay? And you say, well, what's the distinction between that and a static rule engine? Well, it's around 57%, okay? And you can directly quantify that, if you had to, comparing what Spark delivers in terms of a fully AI automated system and security control to your own engineers trying to react to events and probably spend nights and weekends when under attack to try to maintain availability, okay? But there's a cost associated with that. I mean, 57% of the average attack rate, of the average duration, and you could get a value. I actually wrote a paper about it if you'd want to see it, okay? But we use machine learning to manage event sprawl. So imagine that, you know, in the context of application security, you could see thousands or hundreds of thousands of events depending on the size of your business in a single day. The engine actually categorizes those events, and it's showing the analyst who's evaluating them what's new and what's you've already seen in the past. Because we want to try to accelerate the time of the analyst, the amount of time they're spending in analyzing the events themselves, okay? It also is around policy automation. So imagine that 10 years ago, it may have been practical to tune web application policy, okay, with humans. I don't think it was very practical, even back then. I could tell you some stories. But today, it's completely unsustainable. And so the fact that the engine is also managing policy automation at the same time and providing recommendations to certain clients who prefer not to have positive security models and fully automated policy implementation. And the last is like a SOC assistance machine learning, okay? So I'm acquiring the technology, I'm under attack, I see some leakage. I want to know why. Well, the machine learning would actually explain to you that the reason that there's leakage is because there's attack traffic at a certain percentage coming from a country that also falls into your peacetime profile. And the machine chose not to block it because we do not want to interfere with legitimate users. And it will give you the method to go ahead and block it if you choose to do so, and the impact associated with that at a percentage of traffic that is likely to have a consequence in your legitimate topology. Okay? So really, really advanced, fascinating stuff. Building upon 20 years of production experience, living within iMix and different ecosystems, and having the lowest false positives on the planet. Okay? Now, this has been a huge innovation for us. And that's the ability to deliver, sorry, I should probably take a step back and explain the left-hand side of this slide. Do most people in the room understand that when managing attacks, we're diverting traffic either through a scrubbing center? In the context of always-on security, we divert all the time, okay? In the context of application security, you're changing your DNS record to route through the platform continuously. Okay, pretty straightforward. I think everyone understands that. What we delivered last year was the ability to avoid all diversions. You do not have to expose your certificates to the platform. You can deliver this same technology that we've been talking about over API to an ingress controller, either in public cloud, in your own private data center, maybe even to mutualize application security across a wide disparate set of tools, okay? And that's fascinating because you're optimizing cost, latency, and complexity, okay? And if I look at Deloitte and some of the biggest managed service providers in the world, it allows them to have a common user interface across private, public ecosystems and harmonize visibility and policy enforcement with very little effort. Fully managed solutions in the end, okay? I am 15 seconds ahead of schedule. I'm really proud of myself. I never memorize my slides in my presentation, and so I'm glad that worked out. But I have, I think, another 10 or 15 minutes for questions. So I would really love it if you guys had questions for me and wanted to ask and communicate. I do have one that came through on the application. How much trust should be placed in AI when certain decisions require human judgment, intuition, and expertise, particularly in nuanced or ambiguous situations? I got to tell you, there's subtlety here, you know? of course, you want to, first off, you have the control in the systems to override any system-driven judgment. It's called user confirmation, okay? So this is the difference in my mind, in my explanation between fully automated events and those events that require authorization, okay? Traditionally, like denial of service has always been something that was authorized by the end user, by the customers, right? Spark called you and they said, listen, you're under denial of service. Can I divert your traffic? Okay, this is user confirmation. Inside the system, what's seen behind the scenes is an alert-driven process in the operation centers, okay? So imagine ticketing's queuing up that these events are taking place and they're rapidly trying to communicate with end customers. But when you go into an environment or facing situations where every second or every minute is costing you money, I think that people like Zscaler have kind of convinced the industry that traffic can flow through these third-party systems and provide a pretty high quality of security. I think people are starting to trust these platforms more than they did in the past, okay? And I can tell you that the machine learning algorithms associated with the fully automated defense models, they are extremely accurate. I was involved in a 3-day event at AT&T against the state of Alabama. They were hard down for 3 days. And I got pulled into a triage, and the entire executive team from AT&T was on the call. And they asked me, they said, what should we do? And I said, you should divert the traffic to the defense pros. And imagine that it took about 15 seconds for them to orchestrate the diversion, and immediately service was restored, okay? So I think it depends on the AI circumstance in which you're talking about, whoever asked this question. But I can tell you that based on my experience, the accuracy level of these AI-assisted attacks, remediations is extremely accurate, okay? And I can tell you that I've yet to meet an analyst that was even close to being able to take a capture, look at the attack in real time, and generate a regular expression to try to do something similar. It typically takes 2 or 3 hours. And the algorithms are adjusting themselves every 60 seconds. Imagine within 3 to 10 seconds, it'll generate an initial footprint that is 99.1% effective. It's pretty good. That's pretty good. So obviously there's a lot of exceptions in a lot of different use cases, but in the context of our technology, we're extremely accurate. And I forgot, I kind of lost my train of thought when I was talking about the generations of algorithms. So let me explain this a little bit more. So I talked about the fact that for 20 years we've proven the layer 3, layer 4, negative, footprint that is adaptive and surgically maintaining service under attack. Well, anyone who knows the Mariah botnet, there was a specific type of DNS attack that came, it was called randomized recursive floods. Some people call them waterfall attacks. But essentially, they're so heavily randomized that generating a blocking rule against the packet attributes is irrational. You'd end up with millions of rules in an event. And so the algorithm that we came forward with, and this was in about 2014, actually did the opposite. It evaluated the known good, and under attack time, it would generate a whitelisting rule and block everything else. And inside of that whitelist, then it would do the same evaluation at the subdomain level of the negative blocking rule, okay? Now the latest set of algorithms, which is associated with the encrypted web floods, I didn't spend any time talking about it, but the encrypted web floods are extremely randomized as well. Imagine all the headers and all the body attribute values are changing constantly. There's no repetition whatsoever. And so the modern algorithms actually looking at the request structure, the form of it, and it's actually looking at attribute values between, for a simple example of how many cookies are existing in the legitimate traffic versus the non-legitimate traffic. And in most attacks, we're seeing something like 37 attributes of the request structure itself to surgically mitigate that. And you talk about, how do you get to this 99.1% efficacy rate? It's because of that granularity. Imagine that every attribute has to be true. So 37 attributes that all logically and must meet the criteria in order to drop this packet. And we're dropping it at 16 million RPS to defend 80 legitimate sessions. Okay? It's insane. But I could show it to you. Okay? So in the next 2 days, if you have time, grab a hold of me, and I will actually log into the cloud platform and I can show you examples of these active attacks that are going on in the system. Okay? Are there any other questions? Okay, what measures are banks currently implementing to detect and prevent social engineering scams, such as phishing and vishing, prompt jacks? There's a lot of other examples. That exploit customer trust by masquerading as legitimate bank communication. This is essentially where, email, SMS security is not our domain. Okay, so I'm not going to try to explain to you what Checkpoint and other partners do well in terms of managing social engineering attacks through other channels. Okay, but in the context of what we're doing, this discussion falls into bot management. Okay, and we are the leaders of the leaders in bot management, and it's all machine learning based. It's that intent misuse discussion that I started to have. Really zeroing in on sessions that have been authenticated and are starting to interact with the business portal and trying to identify those that are doing something that makes sense versus something that doesn't. And you ask, I'll give you an example. Okay, so, and this, we also have some techniques, it's called prefetching for performance acceleration. And it's very similar in the sense of that. In most domains, you could almost predict, depending on where the client lands on the page, of his next 3 interactions with it. The algorithms are smart enough to essentially say that if he lands on a footwear shopping page, someone is likely to check 2 other page loads, they do a comparison between them, and then they go to checkout, as an example. So when we see sessions that land on that footwear page, but they are immediately going to checkout, or they're starting to move credits from one account to the next, it stands out. Okay? And that's a really obvious example. So there's a lot of subtleties here. But what we do is we calculate what we call malicious behavioral indicators. Okay? And as the end user, the hacker, is trying different techniques, he's accumulating a risk score associated with that. And how we're defending the bank portal in this case is by increasing crypto challenge to that end point. Okay? We're not trying to force all the legitimate clients through CAPTCHA, or we're not rate limiting down to the 80 requests per second that is undeterministic in terms of success criteria. We're start to increase crypto challenge. And what's interesting about this is that as an attacker continues and has more malicious behavior, we can pretty much choke him, because it's more expensive for him to handle the crypto challenge than it is for us. And so this is a great example of how we're using techniques in order to actually push back in a large event and control the volume, by the way we're interacting with those endpoints. Okay? I think I'm out of time. But I do sincerely want to invite you to grab me at any time in the conference. I would love to show you a demonstration, and I appreciate your time. Have a great day, guys.